Hi, I'm Allen Hogg. We're with Lazy BV Cattle, uh, mostly known probably as the Hog Ranch. It's been the Hog Ranch for a long time. So
And I'm Christine Hogg.
W.T. Hogg, William Telfer Hogg, came to the Grable Valley, I think, in probably the mid 1880s. I know he started the YU Ranch down the Grable River from Meeteetse, and that's how my grandfather got here. They were cousins. So my grandfather came over, I think, around 1900, and he worked down there for WT on the YU Ranch, and that's how he kind of got his start over here. Him and his brother. My grandfather's name was Thomas Hogg. He had a brother named Adam, and they came and worked for WT and his sons. The ranch here, where we're at, and we've been on this ranch since my grandfather and grandmother moved here in 1918.
Okay.
And they purchased it. This original ranch here was the Newell's Ranch. Uh, Henry Newell and Pearl Newell, I think, homesteaded here, and this was original homestead. They sold it to a guy by the name of went by Dad Pierce. I don't know what his real name was. So my grandfather came over around 1900 and worked there, and then he split off. I think my grandmother came over about 1910. It was kind of an arranged marriage, I believe. And he met her on the train. He had been back to Scotland a time or two. He was quite a lot older than my grandmother, Mina Hogg, and she came over. They met in Omaha, Nebraska. I think she came over on a boat and then took a train to Omaha, and I think they ended up getting married in Omaha and moved to Meeteetse. And about that time, he went out and he homesteaded. And he had a homestead over in the Spring Creek area. And then in 1918, he sold off his place, his homestead, and they moved here. So that's kind of how my family got here. And then my grandparents had 4 sons, and my dad John was the uh, third son. He had one younger brother, and he lost his younger brother in the war. That was James Oliver Hogg, and he was the one that the Legion Post in Meeteetse was named after, and that was my dad's brother. And then he had 2 other brothers that never stayed and ranched. They went out, and one had a trucking company around Cody and Meeteetse area. Yet my other Uncle Tom, that was Robert E. Hogg, the one that had a trucking company, and his brother Thomas Hogg, the oldest one, he was kind of a mechanic. He ran some service stations, and he had where the museum is today. It used to be the old service garage. He ran that. I don't know if he ever owned a building, but he ran a service garage out of there and did mechanic and work and that kind of stuff. My grandfather never really had any cows at all. He was a sheepman. He came into Meeteetse. I believe his father in Scotland was a tailor, from what I understand, or a drape maker. He made like drapes and stuff like that. But anyway, whatever you would call that. So he moved here as a fairly young man and went to work and worked mainly. W.T. Hogg was a big sheep guy. I think they had Taylor and Hogg. They started out, I can't remember the name of the ranch, but they had a huge ranch down out of the Rollins area. And they sold that ranch in, like you say, the mid 1880s. And Taylor's, they were cousins, WT and I can't remember Taylor's first name, but anyway, he moved to the Ten Sleep area, Ten Sleep Moreland area. And William T came over here. My grandfather came here and worked sheep with him. And then when he started, they had sheep here, and he had a permit to graze them on the national forest up in the Anderson Creek, way up there, way back in the wilderness. Now is where my grandfather. So my dad and my uncles grew up, taking sheep to the mountain and tending, at least going up and helping. They might hire a sheep herder up there, but they'd have to go take supplies to him and stuff like that. So my dad talked a lot about doing that. But by the time I came along, they no longer ran sheep. It was my grandmother's idea. I think it was probably after World War II, and the sheep industry started to get, was probably pretty well into the 50s. Started to get a little tough. The wool market was down. Lambs weren't selling that good, and predators were becoming a worse problem. And my grandfather was getting older, and they pretty much decided to just get out of the sheep business. And my grandma went and bought cattle, so she started the cattle end of the business. And then by that time, my dad bought his own place down on Meeteetse Creek, the old Tyson place, which is where Ronnie lives now, my sister-in-law. Mm. And so when I was born, that's where the family lived. The year that I was born, 1960, they moved to the ranch here and my dad brought his family here, and my grandmother moved to Cody, bought a house and lived in Cody for a few years. And so at that point, a few years after that, my dad ended up buying out the ranch from my grandmother and his brothers that still had an interest in it. So our family was the sole owner since about 66 or 67, so when he bought them all out. And by that time, we'd have a little farm flock of sheep. Maybe we run a few Suffolk, raise them and sell rams to the bigger outfits. But for the most part, we always were cattle ranch that I can remember. Yep, my grandma bought a herd of Herefords. And and then when my dad got his place on the Meeteetse Creek, he bought some Herefords. So we ran pretty much straight Herefords for the first couple of decades we were in the cattle business. And then in the 80s, we started doing crossbreeding, and we've used a number of breeds. We started crossbreeding with Angus and Solera cattle first. Eventually, we tried Charolais for a while and did cross. And like I say, we've pretty much had some Angus around ever since the mid 80s anyway. But we've pretty much phased out the Hereford end of it. Now we're pretty much Angus and Simmental. And we've kind of moved from a commercial cow-calf operation to doing a lot more purebred stuff and selling seed stock to other ranchers, selling bulls. And so we kind of changed up our methods a little bit there, and that's been more or less since Kris and I have taken over the ranch. So. And then when my brother came back and I came back to work on the ranch in the 1990s, we added a couple other parcels to get bigger. Well, then
to sustain the families that were living here.
In 2008, my brother found out he had cancer, and so we were working as a partnership. And so we were like, well, it's probably easiest just to split this place up, and then I've got mine. He figured he could have his to give to his boys or whatever. His wife and his boys could take one end. That way I don't end up partnered up with them and everything. So we agreed that the best thing for us would be to split. So we split it in 2009. After he'd found out that he had cancer, we split the place in 2009. And so that's how Ronnie and the boys and her boys got their end of the place. So when we did that split, it kind of broke us off a little smaller than what we wanted to be. It just
in order to survive.
Yeah.
To sustain enough cattle, to have enough cattle for us to make the payments and everything else, we had to get bigger.
We ended up buying what we call a McGuire pasture, which upper Spring Creek and kind of over in the Meeteetse Creek area, Spring Creek, Meeteetse Creek area. We purchased that from the Pitchfork. They had bought it from the Nature Conservancy. But anyway, working with the Nature Conservancy had actually purchased that McGuire. It's about 2,000 acres deeded land up there. And they had purchased that and owned it themselves. So somehow the Pitchfork ended up with title to that. Had nearly doubled the size of our place because it probably doubled our grazing land, not counting the farmland, but it doubled our grazing land. Mm-hmm. And that's what we were kind of short of. We had quite a bit of hay land for the amount of cattle we were running, but we needed more summer grazing. And so that worked out really well for us.